Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar program, Phytonutrient Support for a Healthy Immune System, brought to you by integrativepractitioner.com and sponsored by Biogena International. And with that, I would like to welcome our speaker for today. We have Dr. Deanna Minich, and at this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Minich.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Good to be here with you all. Thank you for that introduction, Laura. And thanks to Biogena for putting on this educational webinar so that we can all help our patients, our clients do better. One of the things I'm really passionate about is phytonutrients. So what I hope to do in this presentation is give you an overview of all things phytonutrient as it relates to the immune system. These are my disclosures. And here are our presentation learning objectives. So what I'd like you to be able to do at the close of this webinar is to identify at least 3 nutrients implicated in immune function and their food sources. Also to understand the scientific research behind a plant-based diet. We're hearing a lot about going plant-based. Why is that? What does the evidence say? And how can patients do that with ease? I will give some tips as we go. And then also, what are some other food and lifestyle strategies that we can start to implement to support immune health? Oops. Let's move back there to this next one. There we go. All right. So why am I talking about plants today and not the ketogenic diet or the vegan diet or some other way of eating? It's because if you look at nature and if you look at the research, what we could say is that there's a form of intelligence that is codified within plants. That if we look at how plants grow in the environment, how they're relatively stationary, have to defend themselves, many times when they're doing so, they are producing metabolites that can help to inform the immune intelligence, as I like to call it, of humans. If we look at the literature on nature, and this is actually very common sense, isn't it? It's very intuitive to even be thinking about exposure to nature. And I think that as a result of the pandemic, many people have been outside doing more within nature, taking more time. And there are some benefits to that. There are a number of articles to suggest that nature exposure can have some favorable effects on the immune system. What happens exactly? Well, we can start to see impacts on the immune system, such as anti-inflammatory, anti-allergy, anti-asthmatic, or even increased natural killer cell activity. So in essence, being in nature calms the sympathetic nervous system, helps to relax the body, which enables the stress response to be fortified, bolstered, and even becoming much more resilient. And, you know, many people would say that we've lost our way with nature. And what we're trying to do, at least within the integrative medicine world, and I would even say functional medicine, naturopathic medicine especially, is find our way back to nature. If being in nature helps our immune system, you can imagine the potential of eating these plant-based foods. What we're hearing a lot about these days is how planetary health is something that needs to be on all of our radars, right? It's not just the person, but it's the person connected to the plant, connected to the planet. And one is the micro and the other is the macro, and it's all interrelated. And what we're seeing is that within planetary health, that our environment is becoming increasingly toxic, which is translating into the health of the individual, which is more in the way of inflammation, more immune disruption, and more system-wide, I would say, imbalance or dysfunction overall. So how do we find our way back? What makes plants so special and so intelligent, especially for priming the immune system? This is where I marvel at plants. So the way that I got into plants was that during my master's research, I did clinical work on carotenoids. Carotenoids are the hundreds of different plant compounds in nature. We find them in foods, in trees and leaves. They're the colorful compounds, typically the red, orange, and yellow compounds. And after that, seeing the effect of having more plants in the diet as a result of clinical work and seeing an offsetting of oxidative stress. A lot of the cellular mechanisms just seem to work better. And as I went on in my research journey, had the opportunity to work with Dr. Jeffrey Bland, who's the father of functional medicine. And as part of the research team that I was on with him, through his leadership, learning about the cellular mechanisms related to protein kinases, the different cellular responses. So essentially what we know is that plants are intelligent because they can juggle many things simultaneously, and they can do it in a way that modulates rather than turning on or off. It's almost like they're able to turn the dial within our physiology towards more of an amplified response when we need it, or more of a lowered response. So they are effective at modulating, which makes them less prone to have safety or other toxic displays within the body. Although, of course, everybody has personalized physiology, and what one plant may not suit somebody's body, whereas it might work better for somebody else. And I will talk briefly about lectins and oxalates and these types of things. So that's really what I'm speaking to there. But essentially, as it relates to the immune system, we need to be thinking about our endogenous defense systems. What does that mean exactly? That means that we have an antioxidant and detoxification inner wiring within our cells through the genetic expression that is turned on through different cell signaling agents. And one of those is NRF2. There's also the metal response element. There's glutathione production, and all of these things can be regulated, stimulated, or even downregulated through plants, through different phytonutrients. So when we're eating more plants as that common denominator in our diet, regardless of our diet, we're getting more in the way of fibers. In fact, I just posted on my social media page an excellent recent article that was just published looking at the prebiotic effects of all of these different plants in the diet, everything from garlic to flaxseed to ginger, really looking at this spectrum of different colors and different plants. When we have more plants, we also have more micronutrients. So we tend to have more minerals and vitamins. And I would say, I can just do here a webinar just on minerals. I do think that we are in this collective state of mineral deficiency, whether it's the ultra trace, the macro minerals. Our soils are depleted. We're just not getting enough to act as cofactors for a number of the different reactions in the body that need to run. So plants can help to provide some of that. And then there's the other category of phytonutrients. This would be the many thousands of compounds that don't necessarily supply nutritional value in the classical sense of a vitamin or mineral, but they tend to supply some type of activity. And in the 1990s, I would say that we thought of these as antioxidants. And I would say that terminology has undergone some revamping in the 21st century, because now we actually see that there's a functional signature to many of these phytonutrients. So they don't just sit there in the cell and wait for the free radicals to come along. They don't just do that. It seems that they may have actual structural roles. They may have genetic expression roles. They may localize in certain parts of the body and help to promote better structure and function. So it's quite exciting what we're learning about these phytonutrients. Now, the downside is that we don't tend to see phytonutrients on a package label. We don't tend to see that through whether it's the USDA nutrient database. We don't tend to get a good sense of how much in the way of phytonutrients we take in. So for you as clinicians, this may present a little bit of a challenge. I'm going to give you some ideas of how to assess this subjectively with clients or your patients, and also objectively through labs. But oftentimes these are more indirect lab markers like oxidative stress markers, or even looking at markers of inflammation. Last year at about this time, Dr. Patrick Kenaway and I really got into the literature on how we can strengthen host defense. How can we bolster the immune system using a functional medicine approach? So we published this article last year in Integrative Medicine, And the takeaways from the article I would say that this is more of a public health message rather than a personalized nutrition message, was basically, what do we see as steady Eddie in the literature? Number one, to eat plenty of fruits and vegetables, between 9 and 13 servings per day, or at least 5, for people who aren't eating a whole lot of food and maybe they're doing intermittent fasting, just to look at the qualitative aspects of how much you're taking in. Secondly, consuming dietary fiber. We eat way too little fiber. Fiber needs to come back into vogue. And I think it is. We just call it prebiotic now. It has fancier terms. But, back in the day in the 1970s, when I was growing up, it was roughage and, keeping you regular. And now we know that it's much more beyond that. And that a lot of these fibers, especially short chain fatty acids that are produced from these prebiotic fibers, are actually having some immune signaling effects. More and more literature on that. Very exciting to see that coming down the pike. And then also fermented vegetables and other probiotic containing foods, right? So fermentation does a lot of different things. It helps the food to be more bioavailable because that sugar group, the glycone that usually gets adhered to plant compounds, comes off in that fermentation process. So then it can be more effectively utilized by the body. And just think of it, having something like a teaspoon of sauerkraut has an incredible amount of probiotic species and can be very medicinal for people. If we look at traditional ways of preparing plant foods, oftentimes that involved sprouting and soaking and fermenting, and that can optimize the plant compounds within the food before we actually take them in. And then, of course, to reduce the immune offenders. And in the literature, typically we hear about what? Gluten, we hear about sugar, salt. I would say a lot of the white foods, white salt, white sugar, white flour, which are typically devoid of precious nutrients. So here are my 3 tenets that I'd like to share with you in terms of helping to build a therapeutic intervention. And all of our clients are at different points in their health trajectory. And so I've often thought, how do we just make this simplex, not so simple that we reduce the science, and not so complex where the science is at a level that we can't bring it into our discussion? How do we create that simplexity? And I would say focusing on color, creativity, and variety gives us a lot to rally around. So starting with color, my favorite. I wrote this paper back and published it back in 2019, looking at the science of the rainbow of foods to look at what I was seeing is basically that there is an intelligence or a coding system, coding being coding, a code within the plant kingdom. Now, it's not in tight boxes and categories of, this food is only doing this one thing, because we know that plants are pleiotropic. But in general, through the eyes of pattern recognition, we begin to see that there might actually be a grouping of foods that have functional signatures that would align to the colors. And so if we say, eat the rainbow, that actually has a lot of science underneath it. It has science in the way of the color, what the color means, what the colors represent in nature, those pigments, what they actually do in the body. So I've been exploring that more and more and finding it really fascinating. So the biggest objection that you'll probably get, and probably has surfaced to your mind thinking about all these plants in this conversation, is, well, hey, Deanna, what about all those anti-nutrients, right? My patients won't eat spinach because of oxalates. They won't touch tomatoes because of lectins. And indeed, there are a host of these different classes of compounds that may be problematic for people, and we need to acknowledge that. Now, I take a very well-rounded, I would say, holistic view on this topic. So it's not that I only look at food as the offender. I like to look at the individual and what is the food bringing up to the surface to be looking at a more mechanistic point of view. So are lectins bringing out, or lectins in foods bringing out certain aspects of autoimmunity that are already present in the body but are now coming to the surface? Are oxalates bringing up some specific aspects as it relates to acid metabolism or even to kidney function, bone metabolism? Do we need to be looking at that? So what I would say is stay expansive in your view. And the more that we can have foods in their whole food form and prepared in their more traditional ways, these things might be less problematic, or they may actually be signaling some underlying pathology, or perhaps they just need simply to be avoided for a certain period of time for relief. Because what I have noticed is sometimes people get into these food ruts, these food jags, where they do the same food over and over again. And from an immune perspective, this does not build resilience. The immune system likes diversity. The more diverse you get with plants, the more you're building that diverse gut microbiome, which is resulting in better immune parameters. But by all means, we do need to acknowledge that these can be problematic for some people. And it's a good thing that the plant kingdom is vast. So if somebody can't do tomatoes, well, then you just move into a different red colored food that can provide some of these red colored polyphenols that can be anti-inflammatory. So I just wanted to address this up front because it seems to come up with some, every time I talk about plants, there is this pushback about anti-nutrients. And if you are interested and you've got an inquisitive mind about this area, I did have a graduate student, Weston Petrosky, work on this review article with me to actually just neutrally look at the science. Is there enough science to suggest that these compounds are problematic? So we took them all, whether, all of the ones that I just have listed there, the goitrogens, oxalates, phytates, phytoestrogens, tannins, et cetera. We looked into the literature, looked at animal studies, looked at clinical trials. And our takeaway was that, again, we need to be looking at a personalized approach and also look back at traditional ways of consuming foods. Because nowadays, what are people doing? They're taking raw kale and making smoothies and having that raw kale in greater proportions than we've had traditionally. So the body might actually be epigenetically having some type of mismatch with that type of delivery. When it comes to colors of food, I often like to suggest that first of all, the color is very enticing, isn't it? It's beautiful. People are always drawn towards color, which is why we see that in the food industries, that color is used as a vehicle, as a way to market certain foods, even from a marketing perspective, using certain colors on a label. Color's powerful on the psyche. And when we look at colors in food and of food in nature, this study in particular suggested that red, purple, and blue foods tend to be most dense in their antioxidant capacity. Now, again, let's go beyond antioxidants. It's not just about antioxidants, but there is some measure of looking at antioxidants as a way of buffering the body against immune and inflammatory type insults. And what is the number one color that most Americans do not get enough of? It's blue-purple foods. There was a survey done some time ago in a select portion of Americans finding that 88% of people did not meet their daily requirement of blue-purple foods. And that was done by Nutrilite. So they are rare. Purple foods they're not always in nature. So that's why I consider them to be fairly precious. Now, another reason why clinicians don't tend to dip into phytonutrients as much is because there's so many of them. It's been estimated that there are perhaps up to 25,000 different phytonutrients. So how do we wrap our head around that? And then what happens when the gut microbiome leads to metabolism of these phytonutrients, and then we get other kinds that haven't even been identified? So for you and for me, I've grouped the different plant nutrients into these buckets: the alkaloids, the carotenoids, which I've already mentioned. These tend to be more fat soluble. Phytosterols, which you might have heard about, especially when the different margarines with phytosterols and plant stanols, that they were all the rage from blocking cholesterol. We now know that phytosterols have other signaling properties within the body, especially related to the immune system. Then there's the organosulfur compounds, so sulfur within the green class of foods, especially things like broccoli, the stinky sulfur containing veggies, the nitrate containing compounds. And nitrates, we used to think of nitrates as a bad thing when they were in processed meats. But if we look at naturally occurring nitrates, we're looking at things like celery, arugula, beet greens, a lot of these greens that contain naturally occurring nitrates that are converted to the body through the action of microorganisms to nitric oxide. Good for the heart, good for the blood vessels. And then perhaps the largest category that I would like you to be thinking about is the phenolics. And we hear about the phenolics when we hear about flavonoids. So the phenolics just by themselves have a whole other family tree of nutrients. So we think of the flavonoids. You might have heard of the anthocyanidins, anthocyanins, especially as it relates to brain function. I also just posted on that on my Instagram like the other day, talking about blueberries, like a third of a cup, a relatively scant amount being helpful for reducing the risk of many different chronic diseases. There's something about those blue-purple compounds that are, again, very effective modulators, especially with respect to brain health, mood, and cognition. So within that article that I wrote on the science of the rainbow of foods, what you're going to find is that I coined this term color density index. Wouldn't it be great if within one food you had multiple different phytonutrients, multiple different marker colors? So you'll see in the article, and it is open access, so you can just open access it online. You can see the citation here. You can get it, download it. It's got 19 pages, but I wrote it with more of a clinical lens. So it's not all so sciencey where it's just going to, be completely boring and unrelatable. But essentially, these seem to be the power foods with providing more than one phytonutrient. And I'm always trying to think, like, how can people eat smarter? How can we pick and choose foods that contain maximum benefit, maximum density? This doesn't mean that people should only eat these foods, but these just tend to be the foods that provide a number of different colors simultaneously, which can be a good thing. So how do you help people to track their color? Well, you can do it by, and I have this available to you if you want it. It's through my website, deannaminich.com. And you can just download it through the resources page. You can just use it with patients if you want. It comes in 3 parts. There is the first sheet, which is the why, the what, the how, the where. Then there's a food tracker sheet, which you can have families use. Kids have used this. And then the third page, which you don't see it here, it's a shopping list with all of the different colors and all of the different foods. Many times people just don't know what foods would fall into which category, right? Like they just haven't expanded their grocery or their food portfolio to include all of these different players. The other thing I want to bring out, and this doesn't often get discussed with science, but I want to make mention of it because one of the things that I see in the literature is that the more that we can flow, the more that we can expand and move and become more creative, the more resilient we are. And that's going to confer benefit for the immune system ultimately, right? The more creative we are, the more we are in parasympathetic mode, the more that we have a better, more favorable response to stress, and that's going to trickle into immune activity. We want people to be in creative mode. We want them to be having some kind of outlet, right? And people will say, oh, I'm not an artist. Well, you have to eat. And oftentimes food preparation is an art in and of itself, or it can be. So just even yesterday on one of my social media pages, I was asking people for creative ideas of how to use carrot tops. So how do you take the greens on top of carrots and what can you do with that? Let's use our creative muscle. So that could go into pesto. It could be oven baked with a little bit of olive oil. I actually used the carrot tops yesterday in a stir fry. You can, just let your creativity comes in many shapes and sizes. And what we see in the literature is that enhanced creativity is associated with fruit and vegetable intake. Well, that's good. And creative activities are therapeutic for the immune system due to their effects on mental health, right? What's the phrase about the excellent practitioner distracts the patient so that healing can occur? creativity acts as creating that zone, the coherence, so that truly healing can occur. All right. Now, the other principle is variety. And I think that this is a big deal, especially as it relates to the immune system. How does it relate? It relates through the gut microbiome. We know that this is really hot right now. And when people do the same probiotics over and over again, they do the same fibers over and over again. They keep having their psyllium over and over again. They keep having their flaxseed, or they eat the same foods. They're in a rut. And this, sometimes you just have to shake things up in order to get some response, right? So the more diverse the diet, the more diverse the microbiome, which means the more adaptable it will be to perturbations. And unfortunately, we have gone ancestrally from thousands of different plant compounds. It's been estimated between 1,000 to 3,000. And I believe that that was on perhaps an annual basis. Now we've whittled that down 10 times into now just 100 to 300. So we are not a diverse eating species anymore. And that's not beneficial for survival. We really need to shake it up. So how could you do that clinically? Having your patient either buy a food at the grocery store that they haven't had in a while, just like one food, right? Just to get this on their radar. Bringing in a dietary supplement with a more complex composite of different plants. And again, the reason why I want to show you this, because what we're seeing is the 3 Ps. It's not just prebiotics and probiotics anymore. We're seeing so much. We're seeing postbiotics, symbiotics, all of that. But look at the third category to the far right, the polyphenols. This is the phenolic category. Remember that blue-purple category that I showed you as part of the phytonutrients? Super potent for synergizing the prebiotics and the probiotics. And so if we can shake it up a bit and get those polyphenols in together with all of these, whether prebiotics, probiotics, to get this diversity, it makes for really creating a much more solid approach to gut health. Definitely. So, in fact, I've given a whole talk just on botanical diversity before, and more literature is coming out on it. What is one of the ways to look at immune resilience and also gut health? Usually researchers look at the gut, look at the gut microbiome alpha and beta diversity, right? Diversity score is typically used by way of assessing whether or not a particular intervention was therapeutic. So this is really interesting. I'm sure you're aware of the American Gut Initiative and, just pulling in data and how they've collected data on people. And what this large citizen science program showed was that essentially greater short chain fatty acid fermenters, and we want short chain fatty acid fermentation, right? That builds immune resilience. That was associated with eating greater than 30 plant types per week, greater than 30. So what do? You have them track their individual diverse plants that they take in on a weekly basis, aiming for more, or at least 30, right? That seems to be the threshold, because we can talk lots of diversity, but sometimes we want to metricize that a bit. A lot of literature, like I'm mentioning, decreased food allergy, maternal diet altering child outcomes for risk of allergic or autoimmune disease. So a mother diversifying her child's diet will actually confer potentially greater benefit for that child in the long term for reducing allergenic response. So it's almost like having that variety is very beneficial. So what I did is I used this initial tool on the left from Miguel Toribio Mateas, who does a lot in the microbiome and I would say neurological type of issues. He's very interested in that gut-brain connection. Really nice article that he wrote looking at how the diversity of brightly colored plant foods, even in small amounts, can have a dramatic effect on short-chain fatty acid production. So then I took my own version of what he created. So he was saying 50 unique foods in 7 days. And I like that idea of 50 foods in 7 days. And in fact, I did a challenge on that in one of my online groups just to see, could people get 50 diverse foods? So what does that mean? So what I did on my form on the right here is I segmented the categories just to make it easier for people to track: vegetables, fruits, herbs, spices, nuts, seeds, whole grains, liquids. So putting herbal tea, juices, broths there. And so let me just take as an example an apple. So writing the species type. So if it's a red delicious apple, you would write that down as one under fruit. And then if you had a Granny Smith apple, that would also count as a second fruit, or a second as part of that 50, number 2. That would be number 2 out of the 50. But if you had another red delicious, that would not count because it's duplicating the same species. It's not diverse. So you can have it within one food category. It just has to be diversified. This is really fun clinically to do. Highly recommend it. It keeps people gamifying the whole science of plants and just finds more creative ways to implement. All right, so you've got the foundation: color, creativity, variety. Let's get into some of the specific phytonutrients. If we look at the different mechanisms here, what you see is, at least this is how I think about it. When I think of the immune system, I think of borders, I think of inflammation, and then I think of more, I would say, complicated immune dysregulation. So we always start with the borders because that's the entry point. Do we have good, intact gut membranes? What about our respiratory mucosal membrane? What about the nasal mucosal membrane? We've got all of these different biomes, whether it's the oral cavity, nasal cavity, respiratory cavity, the gut microbiome. How intact are those borders, right? And so if we look at immune phenotypes within patients, we can see that, you know, it's personalized, right? We can't just say that all people present in the same way. You can have an overactive immune system, somebody who's hypervigilant, very inflamed. You can also have a depressed immune type of phenotype where they can't mount a response to a pathogen, so they get frequent infections. They tend to be chronically fatigued. They tend to have a low white blood cell count. And somewhere in between here, there might also be where there's flux in between, and there might be autoimmune type presentations. So we need to think about mechanisms. I'm a scientist first and foremost, so I'm always going to the root through thinking about mechanisms. So for you as a clinician, first and foremost, potentially thinking about how the patient presents and then whittling down into the mechanism. If you can really just get to the heart of it, just keep asking the why. Why is this happening? Why is this happening? You know, is it just the gut microbiome? But what sets the stage for the gut microbiome? What was the terrain? Was there a stressful terrain? Was there an inflammatory terrain because they were eating too much in the way of sugar or whatever else? So continually mining the phenotype is important. So when it comes to borders and boundaries, I think a couple of things to note here. The leakiness, why have we become so leaky? In the literature, you'll find leaky gut, reference to leaky brain, leaky skin. When we get porous, we become subject to invasion. And so how do we best fortify? Well, we hear the most with respect to the gut microbiome, of course. And here's a laundry list of different things that the gut microbiome is responsible for. So again, back to those 3 Ps: prebiotics, probiotics, and polyphenols, to help build a diverse, very resilient gut microbiome, because it's doing a lot of things. You know, oftentimes I'll lecture on metabolic detoxification, and the best defense against toxicants is making sure that we don't take them up into the body. And so having a good, strong gut microbiome that's highly functional can even help to biotransform heavy metals and other toxicants. I mean, just look at this list. It's pretty phenomenal. So if you get your gut on right, chances are you're going to have a system-wide effect of good high-level function. I thought I'd bring this article into it. So if you look at the bottom, you could see the reference. Really interesting, because some of you might clinically be using different dietary approaches. And my premise is not to use specific diets for any long time, because I do think, again, you don't create diversity, you don't create resilience. And you can see that sometimes you may be fostering different gut microbiome variations that aren't always beneficial. So this is where they looked at, going from left to right, a vegan vegetarian diet, gluten-free, ketogenic, low FODMAP, Western diet, Mediterranean diet, and you can see the translation at the level of the gut microbiome. And this is from the sum of literature that's out there and what research has shown, whether or not you get different abundance of gut bacteria or you get more diverse gut bacteria. And the takeaway I would say here, if you were just to ballpark each of these, the Mediterranean diet, I don't know what it is, but it's the most well-studied diet and it confers a lot of health benefit. And as you can see, microbiota diversity and stability is increased, high short-chain fatty acids, those signal on to the immune inflammatory cascade in good, healthy ways. So I do think, we've got to set the stage with food at its core. And when food becomes self, we don't get an antigenic effect of food. I love this diagram and, just to even talk with patients about food becoming self. And this is where, sometimes we need to just start with the basics. I know that you all know a lot and perhaps you want to showcase that and bring that forward to your patients because you're excited about it and you learned a lot. But really the essence of a good, healthy immune system is making sure that we take food, we digest it properly, and we turn it into us. That is nutrition in a nutshell. When we don't turn it into us and when it stays antigenic because we have leaky gut, it gets in without being broken down properly. Now we've got antigens running around systemically. Now we have an upregulated inflammatory response. So the essence of healthy immune system, and again, we're going to root cause here, is proper digestion where we take food, which is non-self, and we take food to become us. There's, of course, the old adage, you are what you eat. But if we eat something and it doesn't become us, it becomes more of an enemy, right? It becomes a foreign invader. So, just a reminder of the basics. And so helping our intestinal lining, and I would say all of our linings, all of our mucous membranes, vitamin D got a lot of play during the pandemic, but what about vitamin A? Vitamin A, to me, goes hand in hand with vitamin D. In fact, they're kind of like a seesaw. They kind of work together. A lot of these fat-soluble vitamins, nutrition is relationship. It's not just one vitamin is the champion, gets the limelight. It's a pleiotropic effect, like plants. They all work together. So we need to be thinking bigger, broader about what helps to strengthen the intestinal membranes. My PhD research was on essential fatty acids. And when I think about permeability, I think about making sure that we've got a good blend. It's the Goldilocks principle where it's just right, not too much, not too little, but just right amounts of omega-3 fats so that we have proper flux in and out of a membrane, right? You don't want something too leaky either where it's too porous. And I think sometimes we go too high on some of the omega-3s. We want to bring them into balance with saturated fat, monounsaturated fat. Fat is complex. It's not just all in one bucket. So when speaking of fats, these short chain fatty acids, whether it's like butyrate or acetate propionate, typically these are the three that get talked about. These act as cell signaling agents through the intestine. Especially we hear a lot about butyrate. Butyrate is heralded as like the short chain fatty acid of the day. But I do think that we need to be paying attention to the others as well, the complex. But look at how they signal on systemically and have great impact. One of the things that I think about when people have just, all kinds of issues, I do like to bring it back to the basics of the elimination diet, removing the top allergens, having some modifications, reintroducing them short term. Sometimes it just helps to hear that again, because even though we can look at all of those different dietary approaches and the gut microbiome, sometimes there's just one thing or multiple things that they're taking in, no matter what diet they're on. And in fact, here's just a little clinical pearl, and you probably know this already, but one of my nutrition mentors said to me, she said, Deanna, just ask the patient what is most difficult for them to give up. The food or drink that is most difficult for them to give up is probably the one that keeps them in pathological dysfunction. I remember somebody with rheumatoid arthritis, 50-year-old woman I was talking with, and I started talking with her about gluten and dairy and all kinds of things. And she says, well, I could never give up my bread, cheese, and coffee in the morning. I could never give that up. And that to me signaled that right there, that was probably what was offending her system. And I do think that we need to somehow be creative about the elimination diet, because people hear elimination diet and they go running. They don't like the idea of letting go of things that they love. And I think ultimately, if they can just give over 3 to 4 weeks of eliminating things and then adding back small amounts, small, teeny tiny amounts, I call it dietary micro rotation. I just made this term up. All it means is that if we have small amounts of whole foods, then we are probably less apt to create a response, which tends to come from larger boluses of where people have lots of this food, and then it really upregulates the immune system. All right, let's delve in here a little bit to inflammation and antioxidants. I'm not going to belabor this as much as I did talking about the borders and the membranes, which is, the first line of attack. If we look at all of the different assessments, ways to look at that, we can get a dietary analysis. In the past, I would have used a food log or diet diary of some sort. Nowadays, I just like to use pictures. I think that a picture of one's meal tells me so much. It tells me a lot about the amount, proportion, colors, variety. My goodness, you can see it all right there. And there are different apps where you can take pictures and start to populate with different nutrients. And this is becoming much more sophisticated, but, just making it pretty basic. Inflammation in the body is going to put a strain on the immune system. So you do want to be looking at markers of inflammation, either symptomatically through lab tests, as I have listed here, through oxidative stress, through low levels of vitamins and minerals. And mostly, these are not typical things that are measured. And so just even looking at symptoms might even be a good place to start. I put this together last year when I was doing a lot on looking at the pandemic, looking at the immune system, and traversing through the rainbow here of macros. So protein, carbs, fats, and oils, the vitamins, the fat-soluble, water-soluble, the minerals, which are so important, and the phytonutrients. And so usually when I'm thinking about general principles for quelling the immune system and thinking about what could people be bringing in, this was just kind of a laundry list of different things based on what I was reading, right? But really, when we have those inputs from the diet coming in, we want to ensure that we are priming on our internal network of antioxidants, that we have enough vitamin E, all of the different isomers, tocotrienols, tocopherols. Vitamin C works best with bioflavonoids. The polyphenols, as I talked about with the prebiotics and probiotics. And my love for carotenoids, the red, orange, and yellow compounds. These types of antioxidants can help to stimulate our internal defense enzymes just by upregulating certain parts of our gene expression too. And you just have to be careful with very high levels of isolated antioxidants. Keep in mind that nature doesn't work in isolation. It works as a team, which is why I always like to advocate phytonutrients in a complex array rather than as a single agent. So here are some of the other ones. I've already talked about some of these already in the previous slide, but bringing in omega-3 fatty acids, which need to be balanced with omega-6s, really easy to get that tested in patients. I do think that vitamin K is the next vitamin D. It's very pleiotropic. It's working on the cardiovascular system. It works on bone. And then looking at some of these more targeted plant compounds, which I'll get into a little bit more. So during the pandemic, one of the things that caught my attention was spices. Because I made a presentation to congressional staff almost a year ago, last year. It was in July, and talking about what can everybody do regardless of socioeconomic status. And one of the things that people can do is to increase their use of spices. Spices tend to be anti-inflammatory. We saw that the Ministry of Ayush in India back in March 2020 had implemented talking about certain Ayurvedic practices, bringing in more spices. This is a picture of my own golden milk. So having turmeric and cardamom, black pepper to potentiate the turmeric in a base of coconut milk, very healing. You've got the medium chain fats with the coconut, all those different traditional practices, the tried and true. So these spices in general help with reducing inflammation. So many great articles on this, and there are so many parts of the plant that can be beneficial for doing that. And the good thing about spices is that they don't only impart medicine, they also impart flavor. So variety with spices is a good thing. And making sure, in fact, I was just reviewing an article the other day on mycotoxins in spices. If you keep your spices too long and you're not keeping an eye on them and refreshing them, they're just sitting in your cabinet all caked and crusty. It's time to, you can do a whole in-service or training or workshop with your patients on spices, changing up their spices, showing them new ways to use those spices. And I put this in here for you just as some ideas as to what you could be having them do with different spices. All right, so let me just, in our remaining slides here on plants, thinking about the phytonutrients. So we have these marker compounds, especially for the immune system, and some of the food hallmarks, which might be good sources of those compounds. And the flavonoids. So if you remember when I talked about the blue-purple, the phenolics, right? I mentioned within that category, you've got flavonoids. Flavonoids tend to be seen as the mood modulators. They have weak benzodiazepine-like activity in the brain. So they tend to modulate mood. They tend to modulate cognitive aspects. They're pretty ubiquitous in the plant kingdom. So you're going to find them in a lot of different things, but in general, having more flavonoids, a good thing. It helps to decrease upper respiratory tract infection incidence by 1/3 compared with control. And, just a lot of studies here, especially on the respiratory tract. When I think of a well-known flavonoid, I think of quercetin. We heard a lot about quercetin last year, especially in relationship to zinc, right? We think about quercetin being in onions, apples, berries, broccoli, citrus fruits. I tend to think of apples, the white flesh of an apple being very rich in quercetin. It's got a lot of protective activity too for the body and for the immune system. Curcumin, of course, my goodness. I mean, turmeric is all the rage. Curcumin and the curcuminoids are part of turmeric, and turmeric is part of the ginger family, right? Curcuma longa. So we see that curcumin and all of these specialty extracts, and I do like to think about the whole food form with targeted use of extracts as needed. But essentially, you're going to get so much in the way of activity with curcumin. It's mostly known as being an anti-inflammatory, which means that it's going to help the immune system as well. It's going to help with reducing oxidative stress. So many different things that I didn't even mention here. I mean, it's got a lot of activity and it's very well studied. And at the cellular level, what curcumin does is it helps to cellularly mediate the markers of inflammation so that you don't get the pro-inflammatory effects at the level of gene expression. So I do take turmeric. I take it on a daily basis. I take it in sometimes through spice. I have a complex, just like a turmeric spice. And then I also have special nutraceuticals with curcumin, curcuminoids, catechins. Now, I talked about the Mediterranean diet being the most well-studied diet. And I would say green tea is the most well-studied form of tea. And what the science tends to showcase, as it relates to the benefits of green tea, is its epigallocatechin gallate content. See, these catechins, which have multiple effects in the body, whether antiviral effects, anti-inflammatory effects, antifibrotic effects, so helpful for lung. And at the level of the cell, you can see that there's a lot going on here in terms of reducing cellular messengers of chemokines and cytokines, very similar to curcumin. And in fact, potentially even synergistic or additive with curcumin. All right, then the third pillar of immunity. So the borders we talked about, then we talked about inflammation. What about the more complicated immune dysregulation? And I'm talking here about, there's not only Th1 and Th2, there's now Th3 as we think about the immune system. And we think about the very complex activity of autoimmunity and environmental toxicants. And this requires a whole other conversation, requires some deeper dive and digging in order to understand this at more of the personalized level. But what I do want to mention as part of this is adaptogens. Being that the immune system can quickly flux, I think this is where bringing in things like plant adaptogens to modulate that dial effectively. So when we need more or when we need less, or when there's dysregulation, we can lean on the intelligence of plants to help bring us back into balance. I took this graphic here from this article, incredible article if you want to get your hands on it. It's the role of adaptogens in prophylaxis and treatment of viral respiratory infections specifically. And I find that the structure of adaptogens are very interesting, very similar to catecholamines, which, it makes sense that they would have a role in stress response. And I do think that when we are out of alignment, perhaps we're out of alignment with nature, to look at what we're eating in season. I don't know about you, but it's really warm where I'm at. In fact, yesterday it was 108 degrees Fahrenheit in Seattle. And I was just craving fruit all day. And I was just thinking how, I don't crave fruit in the winter. I crave soup and broths and stews, but I don't crave fruit. And in the summer, it's just all about, I'm not eating a lot. I'm eating fruit, lots of hydration. And if I just listen to my body and go with the seasons, it's like, there's intelligence. We sync ourselves up with that harmony. And what we see in the literature is that what we have known traditionally in that realm is coming to light with some of the animal studies that they're doing on when you have food that's out of season, it can actually be contributing to metabolic dysregulation. So priming our light-dark cycle differently, there's a whole science of that. And I would say, check this article out on chrononutrition and polyphenols. Super interesting how plants are signaling to our psychoneuroendocrine immune system just by way of what's being produced and the different phytochemicals it contains. All right, everybody, my closing slides here. So I'm more curious about what your takeaways are. These are my takeaways. What I did is talked about color, creativity, variety, talked about the different facets of the immune system and how plants might be a divining rod into that. And I also talked about some tools. I talked about the Eat the Rainbow tracker, because if you don't measure it, you probably won't change it, right? We know this from clinical practice. I also talked about the food variety tracker, which again, you can also obtain from just as a free download on my site. So when I think about this, what I started doing during the pandemic was taking pictures of my meals and trying to count up the number of plants to see how much botanical diversity I could get in one dish. Talk about nerding out. So it just became kind of a fun activity during a very tenuous time. So I want to thank you all for being here with me. And I know that Laura will have some closing remarks on behalf of Biogena. I want to thank Biogena. And thanks to you all for taking time out of your day to be here with us. Take care.
Thank you so much, Dr. Minich. We do have time for just a question or two. one thing many of you are asking me in the chat box, the recording will be available to everyone via email within the next 2 business days. So please look for just the recording in your inbox in the next 2 business days. And then just a quick question. You said that the rainbow trackers can be found on your website?
Yes. So if you go to deannaminich.com, there's a resources tab. You click on resources, you go to downloads, and you're going to see a whole bunch of downloads that you can just take for free. And one of them is the rainbow tracker.
Great. Perfect. We had a bunch of questions about that. Just looking to see if anyone has any final questions. Please enter them in the chat box. We're getting a lot of great feedback, a lot of thank yous.
Oh, yay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the comments, so
I know. This has been great. I
hope it was useful, that it's practical information for people, but with some understanding of how things work so that those principles can be applied.
Exactly. We do have one question that has come in, and it is, how would you balance out of season with eating red, blue, and frozen berries?
So being that those berries tend to not be in season, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, and I would just say it's all about the amount too. So, if we think of the amount of fruit and the types of fruit that get consumed in the summer versus the winter, and in this particular study that I had shown, they were looking at oranges, citrus, which is classically summer. Berries are a little bit diverse because, you can get kind of fall type berries. It's a less high sugar fruit. So to me, that one spans a little bit more of a transit into a different season potentially. And, I don't think we have to be so hard and fast and say, oh, wow, that food never appears where I live during that time of year. I'm never going to eat it. It has been shown that frozen berries can retain their medicinal properties. But I'm talking about, like the amount of fruit or the types of fruit. So if I live in the Pacific Northwest in the Seattle area, if I'm eating a lot of citrus, but I don't tend to get citrus here, that's not as much of a good fit as if I lived in Miami, right? If I lived in Miami and it's more tropical, having more citrus. But again, it's not a hard and fast thing. And it's more like, the more that we're in tune with our body, if we crave a grapefruit on a winter day, why not indulge? It's just that I think if for the most part, if we can stay with the majority of being in season as much as we can and listening to our bodies, I think that's the place to be in, rather than hard and fast rules of like, okay, I can never have an orange during the winter months. So I don't know. I would say play that one more intuitively, but be attentive, right? Because I used to work with a surgeon who used to say that if you are eating oranges in the winter, you're giving your body the signal to store fat, right? Because it's a high sugar food. And so the body just gets this metabolic signal that would normally be used for the summertime when you're exerting more energy. So I think you have to look at it within the context of what you're eating already. A long-winded answer to that question, but that just shows that it's more complex than just a yes or a no. Yes to berries in the winter or no.
We have one final question. When you were speaking about the foods that are hardest to give up, that are causing the imbalance in the body, does this also apply to vegetables? So, for example, if someone who doesn't want to give up sweet potatoes, but is suffering from digestive distress, is it likely sweet potatoes are the cause?
It might be. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't always have to be a brown, yellow, white food that is highly processed. There could be something that we would consider to be healthy or natural or whole food that somebody could be reacting to as well. So yeah, that's fair game.
Great. Well, we have just hit our hour mark, and I want to thank everyone for all of your time today. And I want to thank Dr. Minich for a great presentation, a lot of great information. Just a reminder to everyone that you will receive a post-webinar email within 2 business days that will include a link to today's live webinar as a recording, so you can play that back. Also, if you could fill out the short evaluation form that will appear once you close out of the webinar window, that will help us, creating future webinars. So your feedback is critical. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This webinar was brought to you by integrativepractitioner.com and sponsored by Biogena International. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.